All right, so we're continuing our series, Here Am I, Who Am I, Who Am I, as we explore what the Bible says about humanity, the doctrine of anthropology, and right now we're talking about male and female, and today we're going to try to cover two different subjects under that category. First, the complementarian egalitarian debate, and then second, singleness. So first, when it comes to complementarian and egalitarian, that's a debate that's going on a lot in the church today. And if you're like, what egalitian and compla what? Let's define the terms, and then you'll know what we're talking about here. So first, complementarian is first the view that. So complementarian is first the view that men and women are equal in God's eyes. There's no difference in value between men and women, yet men and women have different roles in marriage, the family, and the church. So those who hold the complementarian view believe that men and women are meant to complement each other, to work together to fulfill specific roles that God has given for each sex. And the second view, egalitarian, egalitarian is the view that humans are equal in every sphere of life. They're not only equal in value, but they're equal in having all the same roles. So there are no restrictions based upon sex, whether it's the marriage, the family, the church. Men and women should be seen as equal in all roles and all capacities. So the debate is, do you take a complementarian view or egalitarian? And these are the two current terms that are being used for this debate. So a complementarian view holds that men are to have positions of leadership in marriage, the family, and the church. So the way this works in practice is that in the church, for instance, the role of elder or bishop, those are leadership terms and are therefore reserved for men. And then in family and the marriage, the husband and the father are to serve as the leader of the home. While an egalitarian will say, no, we're all totally equal. So both men and women can hold all positions in the church, including roles of eldership and bishop. And then the husband and the father is not to be the leader of the home, but husband and wife are to be, you could say, co-captains in leading the home with no rules based upon sex. Now, I just want to begin this by stating that I think this is obvious what view we're going to hold if you've attended this church for any amount of time, but I hold to the complementarian view because I believe the scriptural evidence is overwhelming for the complementarian viewpoint. So much so, I actually for a moment thought about skipping this altogether because it's just so consistent what the Bible has to say about it. But then I decided not to, for the reason that right now in the American church, especially at large, the complementarian view is fading fast, kind of shockingly fast. So I want to spend just a few moments for our church this morning talking about why the Bible's teaching on complementarian is so overwhelming and clear, in spite of the fact that as a church that's teaching the complementarian viewpoint, we're now becoming the minority. So first, the first way that we get a complementarian viewpoint in the Bible is through the pattern of leadership in the Old Testament. The pattern of leadership in the Old Testament is male headship throughout. We begin with Adam being made first and then Eve. We saw that last week. And then you look at the other leadership roles in the Old Testament. The roles of prophet, priest, and king. The priesthood began with Aaron. And then the priesthood was not passed down to Aaron's firstborn, whether it would be male or female, but it was always passed down to Aaron's firstborn son. So the role of priest, the role of the Levites serving in the temple, were reserved for the men of Israel. Also, prophets and leaders were also intended to be men. We see this brought out in really an explicit passage of judgment that all of the leaders were to be men. And I say that passage of judgment because if you remember in the book of Judges, there's one prophet or judge who is a woman. and that is Deborah. So Deborah is the prophetess, and Deborah is kind of lifted up by people who support the egalitarian view, like, oh, look at Deborah and what she did in this role of leadership. And I always find it shocking that egalitarians will point to Deborah as an example of their viewpoint, because Deborah is not meant to serve as an example that women are to follow to move into positions of leadership. Instead, Deborah serves as a rebuke on the failure of male leadership during her generation. Because Deborah is not just a judge of Israel, but she's actually a co-judge with Barak. And then she goes as far as rebuking Barak and stripping him of his honor because Barak refused to step forward in leadership alone. In the eyes of Deborah herself, co-leadership is a condemnation upon the male for not stepping up. Because Deborah says in Judges chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, so Barak says to Deborah, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And so Barak's like, I only want to lead if we're going to lead together. And then Deborah responds to him and says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Deborah says, Barak, because you're telling me to go and lead with you, God is going to take the honor that you should have in this battle and instead give it to the woman Jael because you are refusing to step forward in leadership. And then the kings who were anointed by God in Israel as well, all of the kings of Israel and Judah were men every single time. But we do remember there was one queen of Judah, and that queen was Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And her short reign is pictured as nothing but a rejection of God's will for Judah. So we see in Queen Athaliah, we see in Deborah that when a woman came up into leadership over Israel and Judah in the Old Testament, that the God wasn't saying, yes, I want these women to be leaders as well. Instead, their moving up into positions of leadership was held as a judgment and condemnation on the men who refused to fulfill the role that God had for them. Then we move into the New Testament, and we see the same pattern of male leadership in the New Testament as well. You see it first and foremost in the 12 disciples. The 12 disciples all have one thing in common. They're all, well, two things in common. They're all Jews, and they're all men. Picking men as the 12 disciples only makes sense under a complementarian view. If you had an egalitarian viewpoint, it's illogical that Jesus would pick 12 men only, because if you even look at some of the women who followed Jesus, there's many points where you're like, oh, I think the women are doing a better job at following Jesus than the men are, but Jesus picks the men to go into that specific position of leadership. Jesus himself had a view on women that was very countercultural. Jesus encouraging Martha to join Mary in learning from his teaching instead of being stuck in the kitchen. Very countercultural. His treatment of the woman who had the flow of blood just would have been shocking to all the male Jews of that day. And then the biggest countercultural view of women for Jesus and the gospel as a whole was, who were the first witnesses to the resurrection? It was women. And that was, if there was any knock on the gospel story early on, the earliest knock would be that it was women who were the witnesses of the resurrection, because women were seen as like the lowest form of testimony in court of law was to have a woman. So this was there's something going on with this microphone. So it was seen as the lowest form. So for Jesus to have women learn from him, for Jesus to have women as the witness of his resurrection, shows that Jesus had a high value upon women. Jesus saw them having great worth, but at the same time, they were not put into that position of leadership. Now, we need to remember that for Jesus, as the second member of the Trinity, Jesus does not see leadership equaling greater worth. Leadership does not mean someone's more important. Leadership does not mean someone is of higher value. The reason I say that is because you look at Jesus' role as the second person of the Trinity for his entire time here on earth. Jesus is the one who was sent by the Father. So the Father had the position of leadership, not Jesus the Son. Jesus speaks that during his entire ministry, he was in submission to both the Father and the Spirit's moving. Jesus was the one in submission and not in the position of leadership when it comes to the roles of the triune God of Father, Son, and Spirit. So when Jesus has men in positions of leadership and women in positions of submission, that does not show higher value or worth or importance for one in comparison to the other, because if it did, that would then mean Jesus has less worth and value and importance than God the Father and God the Spirit, which we know obviously is not true. Jesus was perfectly comfortable being in submission to the Father. So this shows us that even though we have this male pattern of leadership, that does not therefore mean that men are more important. It just means that that's the role that God has given for them. And then we see Paul and his teaching on the family, specifically the teaching on husbands, again provides us with a very complementarian viewpoint. So reading in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 30, these verses say, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is also the head of the church. For he himself being the Savior of the body. For as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present her to himself, the church, in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own body. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body." This is the clearest complementarian teaching in all of the Bible in biblical instructions. The husband and the wife, they are to have different roles in marriage, different roles in the family. The husband is to serve as the head or the leader of the family. And we need to also note that a good leader provides freedom from those that he is under in his charge. He is not someone who's dominating. He's not a terrible authoritarian. He's not abusive in any way. That's a bad leader. A good leader cares for those who are underneath him. And then also a good leader takes advice from those that are in his household or under his charge in order to gain their wisdom. So the very nature of complementarian shows that men and women have different talents, skills, knowledge base that they all bring to the family. But the husband is to have that role of leadership, but not in any way that is domineering or controlling. They are to practice complementarianism. That's why there is such an emphasis on the husband's love for his wife. Because if you have an unloving husband who's dominating his wife, being abusive to his spouse, that's not a complementarian leader. That's a judgmental leader. A complementarian leader is the kind of leader who understands, I need my wife to compliment me, and I need to compliment my wife. And so if you're not leading in that way, you're not falling under the complementarian viewpoint. That's why I like this term complementarian much more than the term headship. Because you could be someone's head, but dominate them as their leader, control them as their leader. But if you're a complementarian leader, what you're saying is, I recognize that my wife compliments me. I recognize that she has something to add. And I also recognize that I am intended to compliment her. I'm intended to give her grace and mercy and compassion as she will help and strengthen me with what she has as well. That's why this term in of itself is so important, because it points to the type of leadership that the husband is to have in the family. Then Paul also, though, teaches complementarian in the church, which we see in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15. Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Likewise, I want the woman to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman who was deceived and fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Now, just like in Ephesians, we have instructions here in the church for men and for women. And one might say, well, why is it that the male section is so short and the female section is so long? Like, that must just mean that Paul is this abusive patriarchal leader. Well, when we just looked at the family, it was the husband section that was really long and the wife section that was really short. So Paul balances based on both of those. And the other thing I would want to point out, that while we have chapter breaks in our Bibles, there are no chapter breaks when Paul initially wrote these instructions to Timothy. But 1 Timothy 2 moved right into 1 Timothy chapter 3. And 1 Timothy chapter 3 is our instructions on leaders. So that would have been the long instruction for the men in the church, who are the bishops or the elders of the church. But Paul sees different roles for men and women. Women are not to be the teachers of the church. Now, some object to this passage use by talking about how women are not to be leaders of the church, and they object to it in two different ways. The first way that they object to this passage is that they say, oh, well, this passage wasn't intended for all the churches. Paul just wrote this for a specific issue that was going on at this church, and it wasn't dealing with all churches of all times. This is Paul discouraging an abusive use of authority in that church alone, and it did not deal with all churches throughout all church history. So I want to respond to that complaints about that just briefly here. The first thing we need to note is that there's nothing in this passage that informs us that Paul is speaking to a local issue in this church. And it should be taken as something general for all churches. The first thing that shows us that this should be general is that Paul's illustration for why he's giving this instruction, his illustration is with Adam and Eve. And that's telling us that that should be for all people and not just for this church as well. Second, if this is a local issue only, as far as something going on at that church, the question would be then, well, then that should mean that the instruction that should follow it, which is clearly connected to it, that instruction on overseers and elders and bishops, well, that's probably also a local issue as well. But no one would ever look at 1 Timothy 3 and say, oh, that's a local issue. But it's like, no, it's one long section on men and women and their roles in the church, even if it doesn't look that way because we have our chapter divisions in the Bible. So if we're just simply being consistent, if you would take the leadership instructions in 1 Timothy 3 as for all churches, you need to take the instructions for women in 1 Timothy chapter 2 for all women as well. Also, there are some people who claim that the authority in verse 12 that the women are using is some type of demeaning or abusive authority. And so what Paul is saying here is that women cannot be demeaning to men. Women cannot be abusive to men, but they can lead them. They just can't do it in this bad way. He's saying, I don't want women to be abusive leaders of men. They need to be good leaders of men. The problem with that, if you took that view and played it out, what Paul would be saying is, women, I don't want you to be abusive leaders to men, but you can lead other women that same way. because he's speaking in a way of talking about this is a specific thing that I just don't want women doing in regards to men. So if you turn it to something like abuse, you're saying women can't be abusive and demeaning to men in their leadership, but they can be that way to other women. Obviously, Paul would not be saying that women can treat other women like garbage and just not like men. So that kind of throws that viewpoint out. So I think it's clear here, though, that Paul is just making a very simple statement that when it comes to the leadership roles in church, men are intended to have those leadership roles because of the place that God has put them in the church, the family, and the marriage. So those are all the viewpoints of why we're going to take a complementarian view in the church. So our main basic biblical instruction on why we take the complementary viewpoint is really fourfold. First, we look at the pattern of leadership throughout the Old Testament. God has it as men. Second, we look at the pattern of leadership throughout the New Testament. God has it as men. Third, we look at Paul's instructions for the family, and they are complementarian type instructions. The husband's to be the leader, the wife is to submit to them, they're to love each other, and then we find the same type of instructions for the church. So even our explicit instructions are complementarian. So before we go on to the next section, just really brief, here's the support for those who take the egalitarian view. So if you take the egalitarian view, you're going to find support basically in two places. One is Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. That verse says, "There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free man, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." So the egalitarian holds that the use of male or female or sexed roles in the church no longer exist because in Galatians 3:28, Paul says there's neither male or female. But the problem is that's not what Paul is talking about at all in Galatians 3. Doesn't fit at all for the context. What Paul is actually talking about fits perfectly with the complementarian viewpoint. What Paul is talking about is that everyone in the church is of equal value, because the whole debate going on in Galatians was the Jewish Christians are more important than the Gentile Christians. And Gentile Christians, if you want to be as important as the Jewish Christians, here are the things you need to do. You need to do all of these things to line up with the law, and then you'll be able to be as important as we are. But as long as you won't do those things in following the law, then you're like this lesser class of Christian. And that's the whole point of Galatians. So what Galatians 3:28 is just teaching is the basic complementarian view that we're all of the same value. We all the same value and worth before God, whether you are a Jew or a Greek or slave or free, male or female. You're all one in Christ. You're all the same equal worth or value. No one needs to say you're a lesser Christian because you're not a Jew. We're all the same value before God. So again, it just doesn't fit the context to bring in this idea of leadership roles in the church. The second place that egalitarians do is they turn toward the important roles that women played in the early church. And women played a very important roles in the early church. Phoebe, talking about a servant of the church. It uses that word for deaconess there when it talks about Phoebe and the role she had in serving the church. So obviously, Phoebe had an important role. I mean, in another part, we could have a debate as far as whether she was like an official deaconess or just saying she's serving in the role that she does in the church. But Phoebe obviously had an important role in the church. We had Nympha, sorry, some of the Greek names, it's like, man, how am I going to pronounce that one? Nympha and Lydia were two women who hosted churches in their own homes. So you'd obviously have to say that the woman who's opening up her home so that the church can be located in there, she's got a pretty important role in the church, and we are not going to minimize that. And then also we have Priscilla, who was also heavily involved in the early church. So we have women such as Phoebe, Nympha, Lydia, and Priscilla, all involved in very important roles in the early church. And I would applaud in a moment's notice all of those women and the things that they did in the early church. So important, wonderful, great contributions. But at the same time, We don't see that they're elders. We don't see that they are bishops. They don't get the presbyteros title to them at all. So they're not given those roles. And again, we look at the important roles that the women had at the empty tomb and as following Jesus early on, the people who were still standing with Jesus at the cross. You had John, and then you had women. And so they're right there the whole time, so important. They just don't have that leadership role. So we can praise, along with the egalitarians, the important roles that women have had in the early church. Probably one of the shortcomings of the church a lot in church history is not talking about the wonderful worth and importance and great contributions that women have had in the church throughout history. We need to celebrate that just as much as the roles of the men that have had leadership roles in the church throughout church history. But that just doesn't mean that they're in those leadership roles. So that's where they get the egalitarian viewpoint from. In my opinion, the egalitarian viewpoint really comes from 20th century feminism and not from Scripture. And I think if we were to spend time talking about 20th century feminism, our major result would be, our end view would be that 20th century feminism is contrary in every way to what we see in the teaching of the Bible. And I think egalitarian comes from that viewpoint. So we're going to reject that in the church and continue to hold to the complementarian viewpoint. Now let's spend just a couple moments talking about singleness. So singleness has been a subject of real big controversy all throughout church history. Whether it is the controversy of having Roman Catholic priests who are not allowed to marry and nuns as well. You have the ascetic teaching that we need to separate ourselves from the physical world as much as possible. You have Augustine, his, I'm just going to call it foolhardy view that every sexual act is tainted with sinful passions. Therefore, people need to have sex as little as possible during their lives, which then leads to a promotion of singleness. But there's been a lot of debate regarding marriage and the benefits of marriage versus the benefits of singleness. The majority of church history followed Augustine and highlighted and preferred singleness. So if you look at the first 1,600 years of the church, it was, singleness is praised. That's the goal. That's what you want. You want to be able to fight against your passions of your body and be able to live a single life in service to the church. But then following the Protestant Reformation and the teaching of Martin Luther in the 1600s, we had a shift. And now what's been highlighted is marriage. So I'm just going to say I am biased on this subject because I love my marriage and I love my kids and what has come from it. So I'm biased toward marriage. But I think the biblical viewpoint and teaching on singleness is actually pretty simple. And that is, the teaching should be that every Christian is free to marry and every Christian is free to stay single. That should be the teaching. And the teaching should also be that there are advantages to both. The married Christian has the advantage of a partner throughout life. You have the advantage of the ability to meet your sexual desires according to the will of God. You have the joy of parenting. You have the joy of passing on your faith to the next generation of your family. But in spite of all of those advantages of marriage, there are also distinct disadvantages to marriage. The married partner needs to devote significant amounts of time to the needs of their spouse. It is a sin for a married Christian to live as if they are single. Also, if you're married and your spouse has significant moral failings, that is going to negatively impact your life. If you're married and your spouse has significant physical needs, you're going to need to set aside time in your life to care for their needs and to serve them. And that's going to diminish your ability to serve God by reaching out to others. Because for God, I mean, sin numero uno is the neglect of your family. If you're neglecting your family, you are like an unbeliever in the eyes of God. You got to take care of that first before you take care of those outside of your family, which has its drawbacks at times. Parenting can have the same type of negative consequences. The mother needs to set aside a great deal of time to raise her children, to care for their needs. The father's the same. One of our major issues, I feel like, with the family is since the Industrial Revolution has been pulling the father out of the home. Now we're pulling the mother out of the home. So parents don't spend enough time with their children just throughout the day. And if we're all working outside of the home, then all the more time we have to spend just focused on our kids to get any time with them at all in order to sort of plug into them and raise them into the grace and knowledge of Christ. We have resources that need to be funneled away from ministry and into caring for our families. I got to say, if I was a single guy, I would probably have like a 300 square foot, one bedroom apartment, or maybe not even like a one bedroom. I didn't do one bedroom. I just take a studio. Just give me a futon and a little kitchenette, and I'm gonna be good. Like I probably want some space on one wall for a bookshelf. But other than that, like that's all I need. Like I need like no money to live off myself. I would probably be eating ramen every single day if it was just me. But I'm a father. I'm a husband. So now I got to make sure I have all of this other things to care for my wife and my kids and the costs that go for that. So for all the positives that come with marriage, we cannot forget that there are just as many drawbacks, and that's not discussed as much. I'm praying and hoping, really looking forward to, Lord willing, this summer to go to Burundi and to teach in Africa for a couple of weeks. And Burundi is the poorest nation in Africa, and our government actually has warnings against Americans going to Burundi and going there to travel. And personally, I wouldn't hesitate to go to nations like Burundi like a dozen times a year if it was just me and I was single. But since I have a family that I need to make sure is cared for, my safety becomes a much bigger issue because I have a wife and 4 kids. So for this reason, Paul writes the following words about singleness in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 7 and 8. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. So Paul's saying, I wish everybody was single. However, each man has his own gifts for God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that's good for them if they remain even as I am. And that's single. So Paul, on the one hand, Paul wrote the most wonderful passages we have in the Bible on how a husband should treat his wife. He's got the sternest rebukes for a husband who's not going to love his family and not going to care for those in need. And if you notice, whenever Paul and also others in the early church talk about widows, the first thing that they say is those widows, if possible, who should care for them? Their family. So they are explicitly clear. Care for your family. Keep that first. But then Paul wishes that everyone in the church could be single. Why? Because when you're single, you don't have the negatives that come with the need to care for a family. Singleness, just like marriage, should also be seen as a gift. If I could go back in time and tell 18-year-old Shawn anything, I'd probably tell 18-year-old Shawn 2 things. I'd tell him, buy Bitcoin when Bitcoin first comes out. Like, get that sweet Bitcoin. The second thing I would tell him is, when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, in all those years before you meet your wife, who you will meet, and she'll be wonderful, don't spend any of those times fretting and worrying over finding the right girl, getting somebody to settle down with. Instead, use those years to just go all out in serving Christ. And enjoy those single times that you have, because you'll be able to serve God in some awesome ways during those years. See the gift that you're being given in these years of singleness. And I wish I could have had a better perspective on that during those years, but a lot of them was spent with this, fret and worry, like, oh no, I'm never going to find somebody who will be willing to marry an idiot like me. But thankfully, my wife's gracious, and she married me. Because once you get married, things change big time. I mean, right now, during the months of January, February, and March, I feel a little trapped with our kids' schedules. Monday night and Wednesday night, the boys have soccer practice. Tuesday night, the boys have basketball practice. Thursday night, all the kids have theater. Friday, Isaac has his basketball games Friday night. Saturday morning, Elias has basketball games. Naomi has her riding and horse stuff on top of all the other kids' stuff that they are doing. And it gets crazy. Like, it is insane. It's 3 months of the year that the schedule is crazy like this. So thankfully, it is only that length of time of the year. But for these 3 months, it's like, I'm dying over all these things that my kids are doing. And it's just like, this is crazy. Being a parent is busy. But when you're single, it allows you the freedom to go and serve God. And that should be proclaimed and cherished for the wonderful gift that it is. So I don't know if we spend enough time in the church whenever we talk about marriage and family to bring up also at the same time that those who are single should be able to rejoice that they are free to serve Christ in their singleness. So the mistake I think we make as the church is either pushing people into marriage or pushing people out of singleness, that you could say. I think our language more needs to be, we need to see the benefit and the gift of being single and the ability that we have to serve the Lord during this time period. And we also need at the same time see the benefit and the worth of marriage. But we can't hold one up as more important than the other, because Paul clearly shows that singleness is a gift just like marriage. And so we need to remember, though, that some people are going to get married and it's going to be a big mistake because they're going to marry. A woman is going to marry a man who ends up being a sluggard. A man will at times end up marrying a woman who is like a constant dripping faucet. So we don't want to push people into marriage for the sake of pushing them into marriage, because that's going to be a drain on their life and their ability to serve the Lord. But instead, we should be people who say, I am rejoicing in the place that God has given me right now. If God provides a wonderful Christian spouse and we can serve the Lord together, that is awesome and fantastic. But if God doesn't provide that spouse for me, I should rejoice that I am free to serve the Lord in the state that I am in right now. And I think just that balanced freedom teaching should be what's brought up when it comes to marriage and singleness.